Did anyone else feel like there was something off about Wicked?
Okay, fine, I'll go first.
On its surface, Wicked Part 1 is an incredibly faithful adaptation of Wicked on Broadway, but when you look behind the curtain, there are so many little changes that add up over time and dramatically impact different elements of the narrative. Now, the box office shows us that a lot of people don't care about these changes.
What? Sorry, 1 sec.
And I'm sincerely glad that people enjoyed this movie.
Why should they be happy?
Different fans connect with the musical for different reasons, and the film adaptation clearly delivered on what many audience members wanted. But for me, story and character comes above everything else, and many of the changes made by John M. Chu and his team directly undermine what made these elements so amazing in the original musical. So, for a bit of context, John M. Chu first stepped into the spotlight when he directed the 2008 film Step Up to the Streets. For the next decade, with the exception of G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra and Now You See Me Too, Chu pretty much exclusively directed dance movies, short films, and concerts. Make sure to keep this in mind because it's going to become important really soon. Finally, in 2018, John M. Chu reached a new echelon of success with the release of Crazy Rich Asians. The film was culturally groundbreaking, being the first all-Asian cast in a Hollywood film since Joy Luck Club, and was a financial powerhouse, bringing in $240 million on a budget of only $30 million. This led Chu into his current era, which includes big-budget movies like In the Heights, Wicked Part 1, and the upcoming Wicked for Good. Now, based on his filmography, one of Chu's most obvious talents is crafting compelling imagery. Sequences like the rain dance in Step Up 2 are so iconic that even if you don't know what movie it's from, you probably recognize this scene. And even when his movies have bad plots and dialogue,
Idol's a little rough and neutral. I ain't gonna be in neutral.
There's still a joy to look at. Another major strength of Chu's work is his knack for music. He does a great job of infusing musicality into his camera work to better complement the songs and choreography. And he also isn't afraid to use wide angles to properly capture everything that the choreographers have worked so hard to create. Just as a side note, I still haven't forgiven Guy Ritchie for how terribly he shot Prince Ali. Look at all the budget and design that went into this sequence, and look at how much he insists on using tight angles that show none of it off. Get wide, my dude. Get wide. Now, with Chu's talent for music and imagery, it's no surprise that he was picked to make multiple musicals for the big screen. And his first project of this nature is one that I adore.
Lights up on Washington Heights up at the dawning, I wipe down the awning, hey y'all, good morning.
In the Heights is an amazing stage musical, and Chu's direction brings a level of scope and style to the movie adaptation that just isn't possible when it comes to live theater. But even though I love this movie, and I think it highlights what makes Chu a fantastic director, I also think it shows off some of his weaknesses that will become a bigger issue when we get to Wicked. Take for instance Abuela Claudia's song.
Paciencia y fe.
In a vacuum, the sequence is probably my favorite music video ever made.
Ay, mama, so many stars in Cuba.
The visuals are incredible. They definitely capture how New York can feel both magical and terrifying simultaneously. It makes you understand why Claudia would want to make a life here, and you can feel just how hard her journey must have been. In the Broadway show, this sequence happens much earlier, but the movie places it just before Abuela's death, which in some ways is brilliant. First of all, it adds emotional weight to the entire song. We are seeing her life flash before her eyes, but within the context of a subway station. It's a brilliant metaphor for how she spent the majority of her life in this one place, and she doesn't know if it will be worth it when she comes out on the other side. Placing the song here gives the audience a much more definitive answer to whether or not she wasted her life. The penultimate line is,
I made it through, I survived. Now do I leave or stay?
And when we cut back to reality, we're shown why it's okay for Claudia to pass on. Even though she never had children of her own, she is still the matriarch of a vibrant found family. Because she's imparted so much wisdom to Snavi and the others, she knows for a fact that they'll be okay without her. Her patience and faith have paid off, and she can finally join her mother.
All right, mama. Okay.
But for as much as I adore this sequence in isolation, the choice to recontextualize the song winds up taking away from both Claudia and Usnavi's character arc. Originally,
Paciencia y fe.
played directly after 96,000 and revealed to the audience that Abuela was the winner.
What do I do with this winning ticket.
The song is meant to be when we first deeply connect with the character. Moving it so far back in the runtime is like if the live-action Little Mermaid didn't play part of your world until the end of Act 2. We don't care about her nearly as much during the first half of the movie because we're not given insight into her dreams and struggle. Claudia eventually reveals that she won to Usnavi, and the two of them plan on going back to the Dominican Republic together. There's even a cut song where they daydream about all the time they'll spend together.
Out where the sea meets the sky.
But in the movie, they wanted to make the ticket a surprise, so they cut out the vast majority of her storyline. Because of this, her death isn't nearly as impactful. In this stage show, it's so much more tragic because we see all the life she still plans on living. The sudden nature of her passing adds a ton of urgency to Usnavi's character arc. Not a single day is guaranteed, which means if he's going to live out his dream, he has to start doing so soon. Additionally, by making the ticket a surprise and cutting out most of her subplot with Usnavi, the main character's struggle is much weaker. Having Abuela encourage Usnavi to go back to the DR makes it much more difficult for him to decide between his old dream of returning home and his new dream of being with Vanessa. I love the movie adaptation, and
Paciencia y fe.
is my favorite moment in the entire movie. But the overall movie is weaker because of the choices made regarding this sequence. On top of this, changes like the new framing device, simplifying Nina's storyline, and removing the racism experienced by Benny water down the complexities and nuance of the stage version, which is a major part of what makes the musical so important. Now, the reason I bring this all up is because I believe this is John M. Chu's greatest weakness. He will always choose what seems best in the moment with zero regard for how it affects the bigger picture. And while that might work out for a story like In the Heights, when it comes to something like Wicked, all the changes, whether big or small, culminate in a movie that really doesn't seem to understand the show it's adapting. But first, a lot of people go dancing through life without properly protecting their data, which is why I'm excited to highlight the sponsor of today's video, Aura. At some point in 2023, I realized I was getting inundated with an absurd amount of spam calls, which made me second guess whether or not to pick up the phone anytime someone tried to call me. As a result, I nearly missed out on a number of important opportunities and events, all because I didn't know which calls I could trust. What I later learned was that my information had been sold off by what's called a data broker, a company that makes money off of collecting and selling innocent people's data without their consent. At the time, I didn't know what to do, but now, I keep my private information private with the help of Aura. With just a few clicks, Aura will scan the web to see which data brokers have your info and help you get it removed without any hassle. I do this every few weeks just in case, and the peace of mind it brings me is so worth it. I also adore their VPN and its military-grade encryption because it blocks known scam sites that might be phishing for your data. I get all this in one app at one affordable price, and so can you. Stop leaving yourself vulnerable to data breaches. Go to my sponsor, aura.com/thewritersblock, to get a 14-day free trial and see if any of your data has been exposed. Before we get into the nitty-gritty changes, I want to talk about three major choices that are present throughout the entire movie. Starting with the aesthetic, there have been plenty of videos breaking down the issues with the color in this movie, so I won't spend too much time on it. Chu has gone on record saying that he chose a more desaturated and backlit aesthetic to make the setting feel like a real place that will immerse the audience. So the movie's look is a conscious decision by the director.
But given that it's a stupid decision, I've elected to ignore it.
See, this does not look real. This looks like the cameraman didn't know how to properly set the exposure. More so than the lack of saturation, the lack of contrast and bad lighting makes this entire setting feel incredibly artificial. I used to go dirt biking in Akatia Wells, and even with all the rocks, pale dirt, and bright sunlight, you could still see detail in everything. The sky was still blue, not white and washed out. This is a picture on somebody's phone, and this is an image that required millions of dollars. If a desolate landscape like this can still have contrast and color, why on earth would Oz of all places look so pale and lifeless? I've seen some people theorize that Chu's reasoning is actually a lie, and that the lack of shadows and contrast was just to make compositing easier when it came to CGI, but that's just speculation. Regardless, it's a decision that makes watching the movie actively less pleasant than it could have been, and also contradicts the other major aesthetic decision made within this movie. See, I think it's pretty obvious that this movie is trying to emulate the visual style stylings of 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Sure, some design choices are unique to this movie, but the overall look is clearly based on the film's iconic imagery. This shot of Dorothy and the gang, Munchkinland and the Yellow Brick Road, and most blatantly, the font used for the title and To Be Continued. Even when it's not exact, it's much closer to the MGM movie than it is to the aesthetic of the stage production, which ends up creating a number of issues. The one I take the most problem with is how this affects the animal subplot. A major element in every version of Wicked is that sentient talking animals, or capital A animals, are being oppressed by the government, and are becoming more like lowercase a animals, which are just normal animals that can't talk. On Broadway, animals like Dr. Dillamond are depicted as being anthropomorphic, which is very similar to how the Cowardly Lion is portrayed in The Wizard of Oz. This makes it much more concerning when he bleats unintentionally in Act 1. And makes it much more tragic when we see him on all fours, completely unable to speak in Act 2. So the choice to make the capital A animals look like lowercase animals not only reduces the impact of this subplot, but it's also fundamentally at odds with the visual language of the movie. If you're making the movie look like Wizard of Oz, then the animals should also look like they do in that movie. Now, some of you might be saying Wicked Part 1 is trying to be more like the book, but this also doesn't make sense either. In the book, the capital A animals, which look the same as lowercase animals, don't lose the ability to speak in a magical sense. They're just not given the freedom of speech. Dillamond isn't silenced by some curse or voodoo. The wizard straight up just sends people to assassinate him because they don't like the research he's doing. On top of this, if we assume that they're not anthropomorphic because they're meant to look like the animals in Wicked the book, then they should also have similar limitations. In the book, Elphaba assists Dr. Dillamond because, being a goat, he doesn't have hands with which to do research. But in the movie, we see animals like Bear Nanny and Wolf OBGYN do things with their hands or bodies that normal animals don't do. So why not just have them be anthropomorphic? The different approaches to animal design in the book versus the musical are directly tied to the differences in their narrative. But since Chu puts visuals over storytelling, he doesn't understand how mixing and matching these aesthetics negatively impacts this subplot. Another reason that making Wicked Part 1 look like Wizard of Oz doesn't really make sense is because the plot and characterizations in Wicked don't actually line up all that well with Wizard of Oz. Sure, Wicked the movie and musical have always been pitched as the witch's side of the story, but in actuality, it plays out more like a what-if narrative in an alternate universe. The witch we see in the Wizard of Oz movie, and even the original novel, behave nothing like the Elphaba we come to know in Wicked. And yes, in Wicked, the public opinion of the Wicked Witch is largely skewed by the wizard's propaganda, but in the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy isn't an unreliable narrator, and the behavior shown by the witch in that story clearly shows a woman who is in fact wicked.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
I bring this up because Wicked on Broadway does an excellent job at communicating that this is somewhat of an alternate universe. The look of that show feels much more like a dark fantasy, and the aesthetics even border on steampunk. This is important because it creates distance between the stage musical and the other two versions, making it much easier for audiences to accept differences in characterization within the narrative. Honestly, it's a lot like those dark romance books that are technically based on Disney movies, but they change so many details that it barely feels like the fairy tale it's meant to be retelling. Chu desperately wants to evoke L. Frank Baum and the MGM version, but he doesn't understand all the dissonance that's created by that choice. These are not the same characters, so their world should not look the same. The second overarching issue with Chu's vision for Wicked is its tone. Wicked is a story that is meant to feel dark and ominous. There are definitely moments of levity,
Instead of dreary, who you were, well, are.
but even in Act 1, there is a looming sense of dread. The whole reason the musical begins with "No one mourns the wicked" is to warn the audience that this story does not have a happy ending. We're gonna watch two good people be torn apart and turned against one another. We are going to watch an oppressive government subjugate an entire demographic. And we are going to watch the man behind all this suffering get off scot-free and leave office without being held accountable. But in Chu's version of Wicked, that darkness is barely present. We briefly evoke those sinister elements with Dr. Dillamond.
That's it.
I'm leaving Oz while I can still speak the word goodbye.
And during the finale. But for the rest of this unreasonably long runtime, this movie is the visual and tonal equivalent of bubblegum cotton candy. Now, some of you might say, the reason Chu made Wicked Part 1 so bubbly is to create contrast between this movie and Wicked for Good. And sure, that could have been a decent choice, but then how do you explain how he shot No One Mourns the Wicked? Glinda thinks her best friend is dead, and the entire population of Munchkinland is essentially dancing on Elphaba's grave. So naturally, Chu decided to shoot this in broad daylight with a happy, upbeat tone. The Munchkins are happy on Broadway, but like I mentioned, there's still a sinister undertone. It's supposed to feel like a violent, angry mob, not the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. The way the Munchkins dance and sing is supposed to be the same way they act during March of the Witch Hunter, and if John Chu uses these aesthetics for that number, I'm going to spontaneously combust. Now, some of you might be thinking, actually Dylan, the reason Chu shot the opening number this way is to create dissonance between the celebratory nature of the song and the sinister nature of what's actually going on. But this doesn't work for two main reasons. First of all, this movie is so afraid of dissonance that they remove the iconic dissonance from the opening line of this song. Secondly, if they wanted to create visual dissonance, we should have transitioned from bright sunny daylight into dark creepy sunset right as Glinda sets fire to the statue of the witch. This would allow for those bright visuals at the beginning, but still clearly communicate to the audience that this is a story that takes a dark turn. Instead, this number beautifully encapsulates my main issue with this movie. On its surface, it's a very direct and literal adaptation of the musical, but when you take a closer look, it lacks any of the substance that makes the stage production's narrative so poignant. Speaking of surface level, let's talk about the final overarching issue, pacing. When I first heard that they were splitting Wicked into two movies, I was pretty okay with the idea. The stage musical is incredibly fast-paced, and there's a lot of room to add additional scenes to flesh out the world, characters, and narrative. But with that in mind, Wicked Part 1 didn't do any of that. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, the movie version of Wicked Act 1 is technically 10 minutes longer than the entire stage production if you don't include intermission. If you just look at the first half of the musical, Wicked Part 1 is nearly twice as long as the act it's adapting. So does this movie really add over an hour of new content? No. In terms of brand new sequences added to the movie, there are technically only 4. First is when young Elphaba tells her sister about the Wizard of Oz and uses her Jedi powers on some bullies. Second is when Madame Morrible gives her a private lesson on how to use her Jedi powers. Third is Dr. Dillamond's secret animal meeting. And fourth is the new Idina and Kristen song that gives some background info about the wizard and the Grimmery. In total, these new scenes only account for about 9 minutes of runtime, so how do we explain the remaining hour and 10 minutes that were added onto this movie? Well, aside from an extended action sequence in the finale and a few new lines of dialogue, most of this runtime comes down to one major issue. Wicked Part 1 has incredibly slow pacing. See, the movie adaptation wants to add depth and significance to the narrative, but it does so in all the wrong ways. Instead of adding meaningful new content, it mostly just takes scenes as they were in the stage show and stretches them out. There are moments where this kind of sort of works, like when they really drive home the emotionality of Glinda joining Elphaba on the dance floor, but this is the exception and not the rule. Most of the time, the more drawn out pacing doesn't mean that the movie has more to say than the stage show, it just means it takes way longer to say it. Wicked on Broadway might cover a huge amount of story in under 3 hours, but this pacing works perfectly because the show is designed to feel like a montage. Every scene is critical, and the rapid way we move through them gives the show an energy that feels electric. Sure, there are elements of the narrative that could definitely be more fleshed out, but that means actually adding more than 10 minutes of new scenes and taking time to explore elements of the narrative in a deeper way. Add more scenes where Elphaba and Dillamond discuss the plight of animals. Add more scenes that actually develop the friendship between the two lead characters. On Broadway, escalating from Glinda deciding to be Elphaba's friend to declaring that she's her best friend occurs in the span of 3 musical numbers. It's not a lot of time, but the montage pacing makes it easy to believe that things have developed off-screen, or, well, off-stage. But in the movie, this moment doesn't feel earned. They've made us wait longer for the payoff, but without any additional build-up. Keeping the same amount of depth, but stretching out the pacing, winds up making the story feel relatively shallow compared to the stage version. It's especially insane considering most Wicked fans agree that it's Act 2 that needs more time to breathe, not Act 1. I'm fine with extending Act 1 to a full 2 hours, but 2 hours and 40 minutes just shows that they don't know how to edit down a movie, especially when you consider some of the moments they did cut out that fleshes out the characters way more than the lingering cinematography and slow pace. But I'll get to that in the next section. Ultimately, the decision to divide and extend Wicked makes a ton of sense, but the way they decided to do so absolutely does not. With that in mind, let's start talking about the small changes that add up over time. And just to be clear, this isn't me trying to nitpick. Any one of the changes in isolation isn't really a big deal, but it's the culmination of all of them that winds up creating a larger issue. Starting with the opening sequence, I absolutely love these visuals. Panning through the castle, seeing the water bucket, feathers, and Elphaba's hat is all incredibly evocative. It's a great framing device that sets up intrigue and builds anticipation, but the use of voiceover doesn't make any sense. We hear a Munchkin ask Glinda,
"Glinda, exactly how dead is she?"
To which Glinda explains,
The melting occurred at the 13th hour, the direct result of a bucket of water thrown by a female child.
Which is dialogue directly taken from the musical, but it's meant to occur after the first verse of No One Mourns the Wicked. In the musical, the Munchkins are still afraid that the Wicked Witch might come back. Everything they know about her is based on propaganda, so they need an authority figure like Glinda to tell them that they're safe now. By removing this line of dialogue from the scene in Munchkinland, it takes away from Glinda's characterization and her relationship with the Munchkins. Additionally, making this line of dialogue some ambient voiceover raises the question, who is Glinda talking to? Why imply a different set of characters that we don't need in this movie when you could just leave the dialogue where it was in the musical and avoid any issues? Now, just to hammer it home, let's listen to the difference between the opening chord in Wicked the Musical and the opening chord in Wicked Part 1. This music is meant to be scary and evoke a mob mentality. No One Mourns the Wicked should never be treated as an upbeat, happy song. Doing so misses the entire point of the show. And even if I'm being generous, only one element in this sequence should be made more upbeat. If you make the music happy, then you need the aesthetics to be grim and dark, or vice versa. If you want to emphasize that Glinda is a beacon of hope and light magic, you can put a metaphorical spotlight on her by leaving everything else dark in the scene except her. You know, like they did on Broadway, for a reason. Speaking of Glinda, let's talk about Ariana Grande's portrayal of the character. A few disclaimers. I really enjoy Ariana Grande's music, and I really enjoyed her acting back in the days of Victorious. I know any criticism of her in any capacity can be seen as a personal attack, and that's not what I'm doing here. I just didn't love her performance of a character I'm deeply passionate about. Now, in my opinion, you don't have to be just like Kristin Chenoweth to be a good Glinda, but to be a good Glinda, you do need to check 2 boxes. First, you should be fun. Elphaba has a few jokes throughout the musical.
Blonde.
But she's very much the straight man in the comedic duo. Well, if you've read the book, straight might not be the best word, but you get what I mean. In a musical that is full of heavy themes and dark aesthetics, Glinda the Good is a ray of sunshine. And Ariana Grande absolutely nails this aspect.
Strangers are just people I've never met.
On a moment-to-moment basis, she's incredibly fun to watch. Her delivery of this line,
What? Sorry, 1 sec. What?
had me audibly laughing out loud in the theater, and the way she says,
Back out.
gets me every time. Her performance in this movie instantly became, as the kids say, and I totally understand why. The issue is, she doesn't really check off the second box, which is that a good Glinda needs to have hidden depth. A common mistake performers make when inhabiting the role of Glinda is playing her in a way that makes her seem dumb or ditzy. Ariana's performance of Glinda is different, but still very much in the same vein as her performance as Cat in Victorious. Friendly, popular, but also a little slow.
Bonk.
For so much of the runtime, Ariana has this look in her eyes that makes it seem like she's not actually in the moment. She has this doe-eyed deer in headlights look that she constantly returns to, which makes her feel disconnected from everyone else, on top of making her performance incredibly one-note. When you look at good Glindas like Kristin Chenoweth, or some of the other actresses who have played her on Broadway, they have an intensity and presence in their eyes at all times. Glinda is not a character who is thoughtless. She's just a character who struggles to understand other people's perspective.
This must be what other people feel like.
Her mind should be firing on all cylinders. At all times, she should be planning out how to get her way and how she wants her life to go. That's why when things don't go her way, she has such a hard time accepting it. She had a plan, but that plan is now ruined. Ariana, on the other hand, constantly feels like she's behind the ball and not as smart as the other characters. Anna Camp in Pitch Perfect is actually a perfect example of how to make a character who lacks perspective, but is clearly passionate and intelligent.
I have notes. Oh my god. The rubbing together of your vocal cords at above average rates without proper lubrication.
Aside from intellectual depth, I also think Grande's performance lacks emotional depth. Look at these shots from No One Mourns the Wicked. In this moment, Glinda believes that her best friend has just died, but she's being forced to celebrate the greatest tragedy she's ever experienced. But Grande's expression in these moments communicates confusion rather than conflict. She still looks just as doe-eyed and naive as in the rest of the movie. I'm not making any accusations about the actual actress, but for 90% of this movie, the character looks like she ate one too many gummies. Like, look at this shot between Glinda and Elphaba. Look at their eyes. Can you honestly tell me that they are equally in the moment? I think if I had to summarize my issue with Grande, it's that it constantly feels like she's acting. She's doing an incredibly good impression of Glinda, but she isn't becoming Glinda. Meanwhile, Cynthia is inhabiting the character of Elphaba. When watching her in this movie, the actress disappeared and the character was brought to life. And that's what's ultimately missing from the portrayal of Glinda. Also, quick side note, Grande is a great singer, but I really don't like the technique she uses when singing the operatic sections. I was talking about this with my girlfriend
who lives in Canada.
And she pointed out that compared to someone like Kristen, she doesn't seem to exhibit good breath control. She's struggling with getting tall vowels, which makes sense because her background is in pop, and even though these notes are well within her range, she's showing a ton of tension in her throat and coming from below the note instead of up and over it. By the way, my girlfriend has years of training as a vocalist in opera and musical theater. She's not just like some random person throwing out criticism. So I'm kind of mixed on the choice to make Elfie's nanny a bear. In some ways, it fleshes out Elfie's character and helps set up why she is more sympathetic to animals than everyone else. That being said, I think the setup takes away from the messaging of the movie. In the musical, the reason Elphaba is so kind to animals is because she is also ostracized and seen as lesser. She's deeply empathetic and thinks everyone deserves to be treated based on the content of their character rather than their physical appearance. Having her empathy stem from having a nice bear nanny is kind of like those men that are terrible to women until someone points out that their mom and sisters are also women. Or like in Act 2 of Wicked, when the wizard goes, "Wait, she was my daughter? Now I feel bad." Giving Elphaba fewer literal connections to capital A animals makes it much more impactful when she risks everything to fight for their rights. Also, if we're gonna include more scenes of Elphaba's nanny, they should have written her like in the book. That character is so out of pocket, it's hilarious. And it would also explain where Elphaba learned to be so sassy. This issue is pretty minor, but the choreography in No One Mourns the Wicked really feels inappropriate given the nature of the song. All the choreo in this movie feels like it's designed to be replicated on TikTok, which, even though it's not my style, works for the most part on a narrative level. Songs like What Is This Feeling and Dancing Through Life are about college kids on a college campus. One Short Day is about citizens of Emerald City who are meant to be flamboyant and performative. But once again, No One Mourns the Wicked is about dancing on the grave of an animal rights activist. Grabbing their skirts and doing these leg movements doesn't make sense for the emotion of the scene and the context within the narrative. On Broadway, the choreo for this sequence is all about striking sharp poses as a group. They're celebrating what they believe is a victory over evil, but the way they do so makes them appear just as evil. I'm not saying the choreography isn't good, but it definitely shouldn't be occurring at this point in the narrative. The last thing I'll say about this number is that the title should have dropped at the end of this song. Chu decided to do the title drop alongside swelling background music after we flash back to the past. But this shows a misunderstanding of what Wicked actually is. Wicked is not a fun, fantastical musical like this title drop would imply. It has fun fantasy elements, but overall, it's a grim look at how people are quick to believe propaganda and are all too happy to throw minorities under the bus because it's easier to blame them than to blame those in power. And if any of you are thinking, Dylan, you're trying too hard to make this deep. No. I'm not. The original author of the book is a gay man who's deeply focused on how minority demographics are villainized, and even the most bubblegum fun time musical sequences are still deeply political.
Celebrated heads of state, did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh.
A title drop should happen directly before or after your thesis statement, and the story's thesis is quite literally,
No one mourns the wicked!
all this fun stuff with Glinda and Shiz, that's a lie. It's a facade. It's a beautiful what might have been, but never could be. I know it seems small, but placing the title drop here shows that Chu doesn't know what this story is really about, and this is further supported by my next issue. In a behind-the-scenes featurette, Chu explains that one of his concerns with casting Ariana Grande would be that it would take away focus from the rest of the movie, that people would focus on Ariana the celebrity and not on what's actually important, the characters. Ironically, Chu himself is clearly biased towards Ariana, and wound up centering many scenes around her version of Glinda, when Elphaba, you know, the one this movie is named after, should have been the focus. At times, this is a more subtle phenomenon. Remember when I pointed out that they moved this line?
Glinda! Exactly how dead is she?
Well, normally the first line of the show is, "Good news, she's dead." So rather than the opening sentence being about Elphaba, the first thing anyone hears in this movie is Glinda's name. And the question being asked centers the narrative around Glinda's reaction to Elphaba's death rather than Elphaba herself. Now, one could argue that No One Mourns the Wicked as a framing device has always centered around Glinda, and it's not until the flashback that Elphaba becomes the main focus. And that's a good point, but once again, Chu decided Glinda was much more important. On Broadway, when we transition back in time, older Glinda says,
It was a long time ago. We were both very young.
prompting young Elphaba to make her big entrance. Glinda might be narrating the flashback, but the blocking clearly demonstrates that Elphaba is the main character. In the movie, though, we transition to young Glinda before seeing anyone else. It's through her eyes that we see Shiz for the first time, and when Elphie makes her entrance, it's an intrusion into Glinda's world. On stage, Glinda gets a big entrance, but she's clearly a character entering into Elphaba's story, not the other way around. This is such a crazy choice. Imagine if Harry Potter started off with Ron Weasley showing up to Hogwarts, and then Harry walks onto the screen after the fact. The real story has just started, and already, Chu has demonstrated that he doesn't understand basic elements of this narrative. Moving on to Elphaba's big entrance, this is another example of sacrificing story for the sake of visuals. Sure, the direction of the scene gives her immense gravitas, but that isn't the same as narrative focus. Also, giving her this much gravitas completely misses the point. When Elphaba first shows up in the narrative, she isn't a big deal. She's just an awkward young woman with special powers. Chu shoots her entrance like she's some sort of villain, but the whole point of this story is that she didn't start out as one, and technically, she doesn't ever become a villain. The persona of the Wicked Witch is made out to be one through propaganda. The point is, the Broadway show gets that Elphaba is the main character, and that the main character has not yet become the Wicked Witch. The movie, on the other hand, does not. Additionally, if a major point of the narrative is to create empathy for a character normally depicted as a villain, it doesn't make sense to shoot her from behind. Eyes are how we connect with people, and shooting her from the back communicates to the audience that she is other. Despite all my problems with her entrance, Cynthia Erivo's Elphaba is one of my favorite elements of this movie. Erivo brings so much gravity to the performance, and none of the acting choices she made ever took me out of the movie. Unlike Grande, I think she much more consciously creates her own interpretation of the character, and for the most part, this works out excellently. Her vocals have a very different sound from Idina, and it brings out a different side to the character during the musical numbers.
The wizard and
If Idina is a precise violin, Cynthia is more of a warm cello sound. My one real critique isn't even an issue with the quality of her acting, but rather the direction. The Elphaba in the movie comes off a lot more confident than in the stage musical.
Fine. Let's get this over with.
Which is interesting, but gives the character less room to grow. Take the way she initially confronts everyone when they stare at her. On stage, Elphaba is depicted as being much more insecure.
Might as well get this over with. No, I'm not seasick. Yes, I've always been green. No, I didn't eat grass as a child.
She's clearly hurt by everyone staring at her and is projecting some of her fears onto them. She's coming in hot and volatile, which makes it feel like the crowd still has the upper hand. In the movie, though, Cynthia's performance is far more calm and collected.
No, I did not eat grass as a child. I've always been green.
She seems emotionally unaffected by the crowd, which makes her come across like Rabbit in 8 Mile.
Hey, I'm outie. Here, tell these people something they don't know about me.
Now, one could argue this is just an example of what's said during Dancing Through Life.
She doesn't give a twig what anyone thinks.
But having her always behave in this manner makes it less impactful later in the narrative. On Broadway, Elphaba goes from being visibly affected by others to being able to hide how others affect her to finally not caring what other people think in the Act 1 finale. Cynthia's performance is amazing, but some of her choices just reduce the character's dynamic range. In a similar vein, her costume design seriously undercuts her character arc. Elphaba's outfit here is supposed to be fugly. She doesn't know how to dress or how to highlight her natural beauty. That's the whole reason she needs Glinda to give her a makeover. She's like Anne Hathaway in Princess Diaries. But in the movie version, Elphaba's outfit isn't anything strange aside from its color, and her hair looks totally fine, if not really good. So when Fiyero tells her,
"You've been Glindified,"
it comes off as forced instead of being a noticeable transformation. It also just feels a bit problematic to have a white girl tell a black woman the proper way to style her hair. I'm a big fan of Michelle Yeoh in general, and I specifically really liked the last time she collaborated with John Chu, but I was really disappointed by her use in this movie. First of all, she can't sing.
Tell him of you in advance.
I know she only has a few lines of singing in this movie, and a few more in the next, but don't cast people who can't sing in roles that require singing. If you were okay with her talk singing the opening to Wizard and I, why not just cut out the music entirely? Additionally, they really changed the vibe of this character, but didn't follow through. On Broadway, Madame Morrible is played mostly for laughs and is overly theatrical.
Never apologize for talent! Talent is a gift!
In the movie, they decided to make her more icy and reserved, which is theoretically fine. If Michelle Yeoh gave a performance in this movie like she did in Crazy Rich Asians,
you will never be enough.
You'd really believe that this woman is capable of puppeteering the wizard and orchestrating a conspiracy. But Yeoh's performance in this movie just lacks a lot of the intensity seen in Crazy Rich Asians or Everything Everywhere All at Once. She doesn't feel icy, she just feels low energy. A character like Eleanor doesn't say much, but when she does, it'll cut you to your core.
To get him off, the floor was swept.
This version of Morrible, on the other hand, just seems generally disinterested in the people around her. I get what they were going for, but I don't think they accomplished it in this particular performance. I'm also just salty because if they had gone for the traditional characterization of Madame Morrible, Bette Midler would have been the perfect casting. And guess what? She can actually sing. This is a small issue, but the choice to cast Michelle Yeoh also makes one of the key aspects of Morrible's character feel kind of problematic. See, Morrible is known for using incorrect and made-up words.
And whether you are here to study law, logic, or linguification...
On stage, she talks in a way that's meant to seem elegant and intellectual, but the use of fake words reveals that she doesn't actually know what she's talking about. She's just making it seem like she's super intelligent so that people will listen to her and are therefore easier to control. This is incredibly important because this is one of Wicked's main themes. Appearances are more important than reality. Morrible and the wizard don't understand the Grimmery, but as long as they make people think they do, they get to stay in control. They have an easy time discrediting Elphaba as a villain because of the color of her skin.
Her green skin is but an outward manifestorium of her twisted nature.
But because Michelle Yeoh has a non-English accent, when she uses incorrect words, it can come across as a language barrier issue rather than foreshadowing that the character isn't all she appears to be. In Crazy Rich Asians, Michelle Yeoh comes across as hyper-intelligent in both English and Chinese, but that's because she never misspoke in either language. Her accent doesn't make her appear unintelligent in Wicked, but it does change how certain moments play compared to actresses with an exaggerated English accent. So when I first saw this actress appear on screen, I knew I recognized her from somewhere, but couldn't figure out what she had been in. And then it finally dawned on me. Keala Settle is an awesome actress, and I'm glad that she got to be a part of this movie, but it shouldn't have been at the expense of Madame Morrible. See, both her major scenes are just bits of dialogue that used to belong to Eminem. On stage, Morrible is the one who greets Nessa Rose,
What a tragically beautiful face you have.
and is visibly disgusted by Elphaba.
And who is
I'm beautifully tragic.
In the movie, though, they give this to Keala Settle,
How tragically beautiful you are.
and while it might seem like a non-issue, it's actually really important that Morrible initially dismisses Elphaba in the same way she dismissed Glinda.
Not to fret. We'll find some place to put you.
Seeing her do a 180 once Elphaba exhibits magical abilities makes it clear to the audience that her character only cares about the people she can use or manipulate.
And that is my special talent, encouraging talent.
This is why, once Elphaba goes rogue, Morrible pretends that she always adored Glinda and makes her a star protege in Act 2. But because Michelle Yeoh never interacts with Elphie until this happens, the movie doesn't set up how Two-Face the character actually is. Additionally, when Dr. Dillamond gets taken away in the movie, it's Settle's character that introduces their new teacher.
Your new history professor has prepared a special presentation.
But, as is often the case in this film, Chu doesn't understand the things he's changing. It needs to be Eminem who introduces this change, because she's the one behind it. She is headmistress, and nothing goes on at Shiz without her say-so. Just like in the Heights, I think Chu made this change for the sake of surprise. After all, if we see Morrible condoning this action, the audience might suspect that she's the bad guy. But that's the point. Wicked is about how bad people can do bad things and get away with it as long as they've brainwashed enough of the population. If you make one small negative change at a time, people either don't notice or aren't willing to fight against it. We, the audience, are meant to suspect that something is off about Madame Morrible, but it doesn't matter because we can't intervene. Chu seems to think that surprise is more important than narrative setup or fleshing out characters. But what this really does is just make the narrative less impactful. The best surprises are the ones that feel inevitable in retrospect. But when you don't set things up in a meaningful way, you just make the reveal less satisfying. I'm sorry, but this adaptation tries to fix so many things that aren't broken and winds up breaking way more than it fixes. The Wizard and I is a great song, and Cynthia does a great job, but there's a small bit of choreography that doesn't make sense to me. Towards the end of the song, Elphie is running through an empty field and winds up levitating a good distance off the ground. First of all, if we assume that, like in previous depictions of the character, the magic broom is what allows Elphaba to fly, her having the ability to levitate without it doesn't really make sense. But honestly, the movie version gives her a lot of new powers, like one single Vietnam flashback to the future. So I don't really care too much about this inconsistency. But assuming she does have the power to levitate on her own, it still shouldn't happen here. The movie clearly communicates that, like Anakin Skywalker, Elphaba's powers get activated during moments of intense emotion.
She was alive. I felt it.
With that in mind, shouldn't she levitate during the final note, seeing as that's the emotional climax of the song? Like, they even have her run up to the edge of a cliff, which is an image that clearly evokes either the idea of falling or flying. Having Cynthia open her arms up wide and have her toes hover ever so slightly off the ground would be an incredible way to set up Defying Gravity later in the movie. It would show that once she truly embraces who she is, no one and nothing can ever bring her down. Hey, that would make a good lyric in a song. By putting the levitation where they do, the magic only makes for a good trailer shot rather than a significant moment for the character. But as we've just established, this movie thinks that good foreshadowing is a spoiler. Side note, during this number, we get a few shots where things are blocking the overhead sunlight, and the colors actually look pretty decent. So it really seems to me like a lighting issue rather than an aesthetic choice. Full disclosure, What Is This Feeling is the song that first got me into Wicked, so I'm naturally going to be kind of precious about it. The main thing that annoys me about this sequence is the use of split screen. The whole point of this song is that Elphie and Glinda are being forced to spend time together in a cramped space. But using split screen, and especially split screen with a noticeable black bar in the middle, winds up creating the opposite effect. Each half of the screen is now separate, and each character now occupies it by themselves. That's partially why split screen used to be so common for depicting phone calls. Yes, both images are appearing simultaneously, but the technique implies that there's a great distance between the two people. It's specifically annoying because the shots that don't use it are so great. In this one, we see Elphie in the foreground and Glinda looming in the background. In this shot, the racking focus shows both people in close vicinity and implies that there is a back and forth struggle for dominance over this space. Even in this shot, which is just a close-up of Elphaba, the pink light leaking onto her face is a stark reminder that Glinda is still close by. The same issue applies to some of the blocking throughout this sequence. When Elphie is in the cafeteria, many of the shots show that there's a ton of people and distance between her and Glinda. Their conflict isn't tangible in these shots because they can easily ignore and avoid each other. Contrast this with shots like which keep them in frame together and show each woman trying to regain control. These shots are incredibly evocative of the stage musical's blocking, which is what makes them so effective. On Broadway, they are literally stuck in the same space. Moments like are so impactful because we visually see people standing on her side of the stage, whereas Elphie is to the left and all by herself. It doesn't have the book tapping that broke the internet, but it does communicate character dynamics. Like I mentioned before, Chu is amazing at crafting compelling visuals, and this sequence shows that off beautifully, but it also shows that he'll gladly sacrifice visual subtext for the sake of visual spectacle. On Broadway, Dr. Dillamond's scenes are some of my favorites, but the combination of how the movie shoots these sequences and how Dinklage chose to play them winds up making them a slog to get through. Normally, Dillamond is meant to be an incredibly lively teacher.
But it wasn't always this way. Oh, dear students, how I wish you could have known this place as it once was.
Sure, the world hasn't been kind to him, or any of the capital A animals, but teaching is still the thing that brings him joy.
A wildebeest, waxing philosophic. Can you see, students? What's being lost?
He should start off the scene feeling passionate and full of energy, but Dinklage plays the character as being worn down and cynical from the very beginning of the scene.
The past helps explain our present circumstances.
On stage, he's thrilled when Elphaba engages with his lecture, but in the movie, he plays it like he's Yeoh getting some good news.
Precisely.
Now, the problem with playing it this way from the beginning is that it makes it less impactful when he discovers the graffiti. Seeing Dillamond go from unabashed enthusiasm to angrily kicking everyone out,
you heard me. Class dismissed!
Creates a jarring contrast. It confronts the audience with the fact that there's something darker looming underneath this story's sparkly exterior. But in the movie, there's no contrast.
Who is responsible for this?
The scene feels incredibly static rather than dynamic, and Dillamond's outburst doesn't speak as loudly as it does in the original. Even worse is the fact that they remove the comedic beat at the end. One of my favorite jokes in the play is when Elphaba offers to split her lunch with Dillamond, and Dillamond just winds up eating the bag her lunch came in. It's a small moment, but it communicates a genuine sense of kinship. In the movie, they cut out this moment in favor of Dillamond just flat out telling Elphaba that they're friends now.
I don't have any friends.
Well, maybe one.
The problem is, this doesn't feel earned. On stage, he doesn't have to say this line because they actually show them acting like friends. And this is what drives me crazy. They've added so much runtime without adding much new content, and yet they still think it's okay to cut moments that actually develop the characters. On Broadway, the song Something Bad is supposed to happen here in the classroom as part of the same scene between Elphaba and Dillamond. But in the movie, they break this up with a new scene where we see Morrible's seminar. Now, I like getting to flesh out her and Elphie's dynamic, but I'm bummed Morrible doesn't get to be present in the scene with Dillamond like she does on stage. It's important to see her downplaying the hate crime Dillamond just experienced.
I heard there was some sort of disturbance in class.
Because her character doesn't care for the plight of animals. This aspect of her character is important for later in the movie, but they remove it almost entirely just to make the heel turn more shocking. Jonathan Bailey is hands down my favorite casting decision in this entire movie. Similar to Glinda, some actors who approach this role assume that Fiyero is just a himbo, but good actors recognize that this side of the character is a facade. The whole reason he's made dancing through life his mantra is because if he doesn't, the harsh realities of life can be too much to handle. Take this lyric for example.
Dancing through life, if only because dust is what we come to.
That's That's not a line said by someone who's shallow or vapid. This here is a man telling the people around him, we are all going to die one day. In the grand scheme of things, our actions will mean very little. We're not here for a long time, so we might as well have a good time.
Nothing matters, but knowing nothing matters.
This deep character is pretending to be shallow because he doesn't feel like what he does matters. And this is incredibly important for later in the show. Seeing Elphaba stand up to authority and hold true to her beliefs is inspirational. It makes him realize that his actions can affect change, which is why he eventually stands up to the wizard and defends Elphie.
Don't make it sound your arsoness.
Bailey's performance is so good because he depicts both sides of Fiyero whenever he's on screen. Take for example his introduction. When Elphaba first berates him for being careless,
Is this how you go through life? Just running amok and trampling anyone in your path?
He plays it off like he's smug and doesn't care.
No, sometimes I'm asleep.
But when Elphaba starts ranting defensively...
No, I did not eat grass as a child.
Oh, you didn't, I did.
And yes, I have always been green.
He immediately calls her out.
And the defensiveness, is that a recent development?
On its surface, it's just flirty banter, but it also shows a level of emotional intelligence. He might look like he's going through life Hakuna Matata style, but he's clearly paying closer attention than people think. Bailey also nails the specific type of chemistry that the character should have with the female leads. With Glinda, Fiyero embraces his pretty boy persona.
Winky country.
Oh, Oz.
As far as surface level attraction goes, these two seem like a great fit.
You're perfect.
You're perfect.
So we're perfect together.
But that's the thing. It's their facades that are perfect for one another. When he's being his true self, he has a far deeper connection with Elphaba. They each bring about a more sincere version of one another, and you totally believe that these two should be endgame. Sure, their romance doesn't burn as brightly as Glinda and Fiyero, but there is far more warmth, and just like in real life, that's what makes for a good relationship. All this to say, Jonathan Bailey is fantastic, and the changes surrounding his character are some of the few things that I think are improvements without caveat. Also, look at this little stinger face he does when he's flirting with Elphaba. How can you not love this guy? Dancing Through Life is a sequence that leans into everything that makes John Chu a great director, and the vast majority of changes made in this number are ultimately for the better. Starting with the choreography, the trendier style of dancing works perfectly here because it makes sense within the narrative. Fiyero is an exchange student who's attended more than his fair share of colleges.
Believe me, I've been kicked out of enough of them to know.
He knows all sorts of styles of dancing, and this musical number is all about him showing the other students a new way to cut loose. Flamboyant moves like this, that feature fluid full-body movements, feel appropriate coming from this character and in this context. Another change I love is the shift in focus. Like I mentioned, the movie often centers Glinda more than other characters, and it's often to the detriment of the narrative. However, this is the one sequence that is less focused on Glinda when compared to Broadway. On stage, the choreography and blocking makes it so that Fiyero is actively determined to woo Glinda. He's intent on getting to dance with her, and side characters like Bach act as an obstacle. But in the movie, Fiyero is much more focused on the ensemble. He essentially seduces everyone that he comes across, and in addition to just straight up being hilarious, it also hints at the deeper elements of his character. Even when it's framed as teaching them not to care, Fiyero naturally wants to help other people. He's bringing a new energy to Shiz and making life more vibrant for everyone around him. Now, on the subject of vibrancy, we once again run into a lighting issue. In terms of composition, the backlighting is beautiful, but in terms of color, it washes out everything on screen in a musical number all about making life more colorful. This comparison is for the editing nerds, but sequences like this look like when you're working with an HDR file in an SDR timeline. In almost every version of this narrative, Nessa Rose is a pretty underdeveloped character, but the lack of development feels like way more of an issue in the film version, given the fact that they doubled the runtime. There's so much you could do with this character, and Chu basically swept her to the side for the entire runtime.
This was my chance, my new start.
Now, even if you say, Dylan, he said he's going to add more scenes with her in part 2, I say,
that's not good enough!
Her heel turn in Act 2 has always felt too abrupt, and the remedy for that is developing the character in Act 1. You doubled the runtime of the stage production. Certainly, you can afford an extra scene or two that fleshes out her relationship with Elphaba. We could actually see how Elphaba shielded Nessa from the harsh realities of life, but that this wound up making Nessa less compassionate and understanding. We could explore why society is so okay with the things that make Nessa different, but not Elphaba. And we could especially do more to flesh out the relationship between the two daughters and their father. Speaking of which, it's a really weird change to have Elphaba only be at school because of Nessa.
Go with her. What? Just until she's safely settled in her room. Make sure she has everything she needs.
In the musical, she shows up to go to school just like everyone else, but in the movie, she only enrolls because her dad tells her to. Now, for one thing, this makes it much stranger that she enters the scene before Nessa.
She doesn't even go here.
And also makes it more egregious that she doesn't have extra scenes with her sister. This movie introduces a change that tells us the only reason she goes to school is to look after Nessa Rose, but then doesn't follow through with this during the rest of the narrative. So then why make the change in the first place? For the most part, I really like how the Ozdust sequence was handled in this movie. The set itself is gorgeous, and the lighting used in this scene is the best in the entire movie. It's both diegetically motivated and aesthetically pleasing. My only real issue is how they handle Elphaba's dance. First of all, the hat and outfit she shows up in doesn't actually look that bad. At worst, it's the wrong style for the venue, but it clearly looks like something that only a highly skilled costume designer could create. On Broadway, when Idina Menzel shows up looking like this, you can't help but go, oh, honey. It feels like something people would actually mock her for wearing. But this movie refuses to let the lead characters look bad, even when it's called for by the narrative. The other issue with this sequence is how drawn out the dance itself is. On stage, Elphie starts to dance like no one's watching. She moves awkwardly and is clearly embarrassed, but she dances anyway because she won't let her bullies win. But in the movie, she dances like everyone's watching. She wants everyone to see how different she is, and is actively calling attention to it. The problem is, her character shouldn't be this secure yet. She still wants to fit in with everybody, but acts defensively because she can't. That's why she's willing to eventually let Glinda teach her how to be popular. It's not until Defying Gravity that she stops trying to seek the approval of others.
Well, if that's love, it comes at much too high a cost.
The movie wants this to be a cathartic and proud moment, but it winds up undercutting what the scene is supposed to represent for the character, because her moves feel way too choreographed. Fiyero says,
I'll say this much. She doesn't give a twig when anyone thinks.
But the way she moves in the film communicates that she absolutely does give a twig. And yeah, Glinda points out,
Of course she does. She just pretends not to.
But this is not how someone dances if they're trying to hide how much they care. The movie also tries way too hard to make this scene emotional. On stage, this moment happens way faster and with less gravitas, but it always makes me emotional. In the movie version, I don't feel anything because the movie doesn't have any subtlety. They hold on these shots for so long because they're afraid that the audience won't get that this moment is important. They have Elphaba shed one dainty but powerful tear because they don't believe in subtext. We just established that Elphaba hides her true emotions, but having her visibly start to cry goes against all of that. On Broadway, the moment is played more defensively. She still has her walls up and only lets them down enough to smile. The character is still hiding her emotions, but the audience understands all the same that this is emotionally significant. But on the big screen,
it insists upon itself, Lois. What?
So, for as critical as I am of Ariana Grande's performance, I don't really have any notes when it comes to popular. I personally prefer the sound of Kristen Chenoweth's voice.
Popular. I know about popular.
But Grande makes the song her own, and none of her decisions are objective issues. In a vacuum, her vocals and the visuals communicate everything that is meant to be said in this scene, and it's definitely a highlight of this movie. Additionally, the dynamic between Elphaba and Glinda in this number is so good. The sisterly bond is captured brilliantly here, and it just makes me wish that the rest of the movie did more to earn and develop it. Speaking of the rest of this movie, that's the only thing that hurts this number. Because the film adaptation often feels like it's an episode of The Glinda Show, it's not as satisfying when this number explicitly centers her character. On stage, this is one of Glinda's main moments to shine, but in the movie, she's already been given the spotlight consistently, so this scene doesn't really stand out. Otherwise, no real notes, except for the fact that I once again want to highlight how funny Grande is during this sequence.
Seriously?
Do you need my help?
No, just wear the throat. It's pretty.
This is clearly the number that landed her the role, and honestly, I get it. She's phenomenal here. Let's let's talk about the scene where Dr. Dillamond gets abducted. First of all, they should have included the line where he says,
"You're not being told the whole story!"
in the trailer, and then revealed the Part 1 subtitle. Secondly, why is this scene shot in broad daylight? The windows were shut and the lighting was moody for the first lesson when everything's supposed to seem whimsical. But when members of the government disappear a faculty member, that's when the visuals get bright and cheery? Finally, I don't love that everyone is explicitly made unconscious in this scene. On stage, they depict the magic effects like this, so it's not clear what's happening to all these people and whether or not they can see what's going on around them. Because of this, it feels more impactful when Fiyero decides to help out on Broadway. He doesn't know if people will remember what he did, so he's actively taking a risk by helping Elphaba free the lion cub. But in the movie, it's clear that no one will be aware of what he does, so he's not really risking anything. It's a minor issue though, and Bailey makes up for it with how much emotion his performance communicates. A change that is incredibly positive is having Morrible walk in to see the aftermath of Elphaba's outburst. Making this the moment that she decides Elphaba is ready to meet the wizard adds a dark sense of irony. Morrible thinks this means Elphie is a powerful weapon that she can control, but in reality, this act of magic proves that Elphaba will never take orders from people like her and the wizard. Instead, she will stick to her principles and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. They didn't change much about I'm Not That Girl, and for the most part, this is a good thing. The dialogue beforehand is excellent and further sells us on El Fiyero as a couple. Cynthia's vocals are really powerful, but in a way that shows restraint. And the scenery is heavily inspired by the set design on Broadway, which is awesome. But I can't help but wish they'd have done a little bit more in terms of visual storytelling. On stage, and in this movie, the number is sung as a static lament, and Elphaba doesn't change over the course of the song. But it would have been awesome if they staged it in a way that sees Elphaba contemplating admitting her feelings to Fiyero. But either way, most of this is just personal preference, and the direction in this sequence still communicates everything that's in the stage play. In terms of musical sequences, One Short Day is another great one. This moment in the narrative is all about Emerald City as a spectacle, and that's exactly what Chu is amazing at. The constant camera movement communicates an exciting energy that threatens to overwhelm our lead duo. We're in awe of the visuals, but like any big city, there's a sense that it could swallow you up if you don't stay on top of things. The choreography makes it feel like the entire population is putting on a personal show for Elphaba, which narratively makes a lot of sense. The Emerald City represents the prosperity the wizard is promising the citizens of Oz. If they just fall in line and do as he wishes, they too can have a city as wonderful as this. But in reality, the Emerald City is a distraction. It's a shiny object that diverts people's focus from the horrors going on behind the scenes. And the movie version of Wicked emphasizes the propaganda aspect even further with the inclusion of a new song. In addition to being an amazing cameo, Idina and Kristen's musical sequence shows us the lie being fed to the people of Oz. The wizard claims to be a miracle worker, but in truth, he doesn't have any real power. He tricked people into thinking he could read the Grimoire, and because of this, he's been able to take control of a land he knows very little about. Side note, this whole concept of the Grimoire is a really cool bit of thematic world building. It draws a lot of parallels to how literacy was often exclusive to members of the church, meaning that the normal citizens had no way of reading the religious text for themselves and forming their own interpretation. As a result, it wasn't unheard of for members of the church to interpret religious text in ways that directly or indirectly benefited them. Honestly, my one problem with this sequence is not what it included on screen, but rather what they cut out. See, on Broadway, right before they enter the final verse, we get a brief bit of dialogue where Elphie explains,
"Nobody's staring, nobody's pointing. For the first time, I'm somewhere where I belong."
It's an incredibly poignant moment between the two characters, and it really develops some of the ideas first introduced in The Wizard and I.
Shouldn't a girl who's so good inside have a matching exterior?
At this point in the narrative, Elphaba is still looking for acceptance. Even though she wants to affect change, she still wants to be a part of the system. And when she first arrives in Emerald City, she finally feels like this is a possibility, which makes it that much more tragic when she finds out everything she thought she knew was a lie. Additionally, this moment draws a very direct parallel to the real world. If you yourself identify as LGBTQ, or you know people in that community, you've probably heard of a moment like this happening to them. Many people in the queer community grow up in places that aren't accepting of their identity. Their formative years are spent in a place where they feel ostracized and othered, but when they're finally able to move to a region that is more accepting, it can come as a huge relief, and it can feel like you can finally be yourself. This is even more important when you consider the current political landscape. Now more than ever, politicians are trying to create fewer spaces where others can feel safe in their identities. Places that were once welcoming no longer feel that way once those in power set the population off on a witch hunt. In times like these, it becomes critical to know who you can trust and who has your back. But yeah, Wicked isn't that political. Anyway, all this to say that taking out this one bit of dialogue robs this sequence of so much impact. It really makes me angry to see them cut important sections out of the movie, considering how bloated the overall runtime is anyway. If you're doubling the runtime, you should not be cutting dialogue. And if pacing is so important that you have to cut dialogue, you shouldn't take 2 hours and 40 minutes just to tell half of the story. No offense, but Wicked the stage musical is not Dune. And even then, Dune's first movie felt way too slow. Honestly, the only part 1 that has unabashedly good pacing is Breaking Dawn, and that's because they front-loaded that movie and left the awkward pacing for part 2. Anyways, my other critique is this line delivery.
The wizard will see you now!
This is the big finale of the song, and it's supposed to be a dramatic declaration. This should be something that the guard shouts enthusiastically, not something he just says. And, this is Stephen Schwartz himself, the man who wrote all these songs and arguably understands the characters in Wicked better than Gregory Maguire. You'd think he'd hit this beat with a little pizzazz. This might seem silly to point out, but I really like the change in the monkey design. First of all, these are dope looking monkeys. The blue fur gives the animals a nice fantasy touch without being too outlandish, and the jade armor evokes imagery from Eastern folklore. Secondly, these are much less scary than the monkeys on Broadway. When I first saw those monkeys descend from the ceiling at the start of the show, I was terrified. We were seeing Wicked in San Francisco for my sister's birthday, and I am not kidding. I almost asked my mom to take me home right then and there. The only reason I didn't is because the embarrassment of making my mom get up and leave in the middle of a live production scared me slightly more than the monkeys. These monkeys aren't scary at all, which is nice, because I saw this movie with my girlfriend, and she totally would have understood if I needed to leave, but there would definitely be some judgment. So maybe I'm the real monkey, because I give this change 2 opposable thumbs up. This one won't be long, but Jeff Goldblum as the wizard is just bad. Or maybe not bad, but it's definitely just Jeff Goldblum. The man isn't even trying to act, he's just coasting on his iconic persona. And sure, the Jeff Goldblum persona is pretty great, but it winds up doing a disservice to the wizard as a character. This lounge lizard vibe doesn't feel like the attitude of an authoritarian ruler, but at the same time, it's too charismatic to feel like there's a difference between him as the wizard and him as a real person. On Broadway, it never feels that believable that the wizard is a dictator, but that actually creates an interesting dynamic. It shows that with enough propaganda and manipulation, even this silly little man can take over a country. Additionally, given the increased runtime, you would think they would have explored the wizard's motivations a bit more. We get the propaganda version of how he came into power, but it would have been a good use of runtime to see how he actually took control of the government and why he wanted to be in power anyway. The stage musical touches on his motivations in Act 2 during Wonderful.
Just because the folks in Oz needed someone to believe in.
But it's not actually given much focus or importance within the narrative. Overall, I just feel like Jeff Goldblum didn't put any effort into his performance, and the movie doesn't put any effort into fleshing out the character. It's admittedly pretty cool seeing the action sequence where Elphie and Glinda are running away from the flying monkeys, but this creates a few issues for the pacing of Defying Gravity. Even on stage, the song is broken up by bits of dialogue and action, so adding another action beat to this sequence further slows down the pace of this song. Adding slow-mo shots and hover sequences before the big finale saps energy from the sequence and makes the money shot feel like less of a big reveal. Whenever the two characters are singing together, the direction of the sequence is excellent, but at times, it feels like the movie doesn't trust that this singing is worthy of a finale, which it absolutely is. Another instance of stretching out Defying Gravity is when Elphaba is falling and she sees the reflection of her younger self looking back at her. This is almost a really powerful moment, but the problem is they didn't set up or earn this visual metaphor. We only see young Elphaba once, and it's during a flashback in No One Mourns the Wicked. We see her get bullied, but this isn't a key turning point in her development as a character. This isn't the first time she's been bullied, and nothing notable happens to her when she's being played by this younger actress. It's not even clear if this is the first time she used her powers. Sure, she looks a little confused, but her father also says,
"What have you done this time?"
implying that similar things have happened in the past. If this was going to be a satisfying moment, we needed to have more flashbacks or spend more time with her in this one flashback to connect us with Elphaba's younger self. This might seem like an odd comparison, but Avengers Infinity War actually does a great job utilizing the younger version of a main character. In that movie, we already know that Gamora and her younger sister were abused by the Mad Titan Thanos. Then, about a third of the way through the runtime, we see a flashback that shows when young Gamora was first abducted. When Thanos captures Gamora, she views him as an enemy, but he talks to her like she's still his daughter.
Little one, it's a simple calculus.
Specifically, we see a continuation of the term little one.
There's something we need to discuss, little one.
And this term is used most notably when he sacrifices Gamora for the Soul Stone.
I'm sorry, little one.
Finally, after he turns half of all life to dust, he sees a vision of young Gamora who asks him,
"What did it cost?"
Everything.
This moment works because we've shown multiple times that Thanos still views Gamora as this little girl. Seeing her now is heartbreaking for the character because this is the person he betrayed. Wicked, however, has a much shorter flashback and never revisits the theme of young Elphaba ever again. This movie is already absurdly long, so why not include an actual flashback when Elphie is telling Glinda about her mother dying? This would connect us more to young Elphaba and make the symbolism feel earned when she shows up during Defying Gravity. The last change I take issue with is that they extended Defying Gravity past Elphaba's iconic vocal moment. This is the finale of Act 1. That is your lights out curtain drop. You don't need any more falling action because this is already a cliffhanger. The very act of splitting this musical in two means that the finale of Part 1 is going to feel abrupt. So why not let it be a mic drop moment? It just feels like they don't trust the music to be satisfying enough and needed to tinker with the ending just for the heck of it. Overall, I think this movie was made with a lot of love. Everyone who worked on it clearly cared about what they were doing, but I don't think everyone involved understood what they were doing. It's not just that they made changes to the source material. After all, adaptations require updating and adjusting certain elements from the original. But it's that decisions are constantly being made that contradict one another. I understand that I'm in the minority here for criticizing this movie, and I'm truly happy this movie is loved by so many people. But I also feel like the people who like this movie would still enjoy an adaptation that had a deeper understanding of the stage musical and its narrative. If you enjoyed Wicked Part 1, I hope this video didn't change that. And if you had problems with the movie, I hope this video made you feel seen or help put words to what you might have been feeling. I love Wicked, and anything that makes more people love Wicked is ultimately a good thing, especially if that thing has Jonathan Bailey in it. I'm Dylan, and this has been The Writer's Block.